Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all, good early evening. Welcome to the George C. Marshall Foundation and our commemoration and celebration of the completion of the 7th and final volume of the edited papers of George Catlett Marshall. There it is. The process of editing these volumes has been a long, involved and complex one. An apposite process when one considers the long, complex and accomplished career of the man that it illustrates, the career of George C. Marshall. It has been a task at the centre of why this organisation was established in the first place. And as we mark the completion of this endeavour, I would like to pause and acknowledge some of the individuals responsible for this achievement. You will hear soon from the managing editor, Dan Holt, the editor, Mark Stoller, and representatives of the National Historic Publications and Records Commission and National Endowment for the Humanities, respectively, Kathleen Williams and Margaret Plimpton, as well as the chair of our board, Mr. Jay Adams. I'd also like to recognise other members of the team, Maine Warren and Anne Wells, Senior Assistant Editors. Greg Franke, Assistant Editor, who could not be with us today. Joanne Hartog. Donnell Witt, Marilyn Holt. Carol Wheeler helped keep the project moving. I'd also like to recognise especially Jo Ellen Bland, the widow of Larry Bland, who worked tirelessly towards this day. Sharon Rittenhouse Stevens. Brian Shaw, past president. The Marshall Papers Advisory Committee, Robert Beisner, Ed Kaufman, George Herring, Alan Millett, Dawn Van A, Bob Ruger, and all of the Johns Hopkins University Press. There are many others who played a part in this undertaking. I would draw your attention in our programme to the long list of supporters and financial backers. As you all no doubt know, General Marshall left no autobiography to inform our judgment of him and his times. The Marshall Foundation has worked tirelessly to fill out that story, to offer insights into this fascinating individual. That history, first through the work of Forrest Pogue, the official biographer, in the magnificent 4-volume set, and then through some 7 volumes and 39 years of documentary editing, a substantial undertaking and one for which the scholarly community, and indeed I would say the wider world, is eternally grateful. The world we live in, of course, and in which we celebrate this achievement, is a very different one from the world Marshall knew, very different too from when this project began some 40 years ago. But these works and these documents transcend time. They instantiate for all time Marshall's life and Marshall's legacy. They ensure the past will be known and that the past may inform the future. The question I hear most often when I speak about Marshall on behalf of the Foundation is, where is our Marshall today? Where are the leaders, male or female, without blemish, cut perhaps from the same cloth as General Marshall? It will perhaps come as no surprise that I have no good answer to that question. But if the question, however, is where can inspiration and example be found that those leaders might emerge, that answer is clearer. Because that answer is here at the Marshall Foundation, on the post at VMI, Marshall's alma mater. Here is the detail, the substance of what he did, how he did it, and perhaps most significantly, who he was. Marshall can be found within these walls, in the Pogue biography and interviews, and our museum, our publications, the new programs of the Marshall Legacy Series, and most fully and most completely here in these 7 volumes. My thanks to the team that made this happen, to those that preceded them, everyone that supported them. You have done history a great service. You've done General Marshall a great service indeed. Please welcome now the chair of our board, Mr. Jay Adams.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the celebration to conclude a seminal project of the George C. Marshall Foundation, the publication of the papers of George Catlett Marshall. I'm Jay Adams, chairman of the Marshall Board, and it is an honor for me to deliver the congratulations on behalf of our entire board. The papers project predates my joining the board by just a few years. At its infancy in the 1970s, the project was finding its footing in the daunting task of acquiring, organizing, and reading the vast amount of material associated with the career of an individual whose leadership spanned some 50 years in public service. What followed those early years, of course, was the long and significant challenge of arranging the accumulated material into a chronological expression of the legacy of this great man. Through various periods of productivity and pause, we have arrived at this moment. It has come about in no small part as a result of the tireless, diligent efforts of the current editorial team that was assembled in 2008, and later to complete the work of the first editor, our beloved Larry Bland. Today, we congratulate Dr. Mark Stoller and Dan Holt and the rest of their editorial team for their efforts to bring this project to its conclusion. They have given us and the world of inquiring minds now and far into the future the definitive scholarly record of one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. As such, their work and the work of Dr. Bland and Sharon Stevens before them completes the scholarly endeavors of the Foundation that includes the authorized 4-volume biography by Dr. Forrest Poe. Following a long career of public service, General Marshall rejected several offers to publish his memoirs and become enriched in the process. As a student of history, he knew his life and times would be studied long after his passing. With General Marshall's approval, President Harry Truman led the effort to create our research library to preserve and house Marshall's papers and those of his contemporaries, and to establish it as the place to study the man, his times, and the history of his era, the first half of the 20th century. The Marshall Library has now become a national physical treasure, a unique repository of the documented life of General Marshall. Today it also serves as a digital portal to the world, making our incredible collections available through the internet to students and to scholars in ways never imagined 50 years ago. This day represents also the beginning of a new era for the Marshall Foundation. The current Marshall Legacy series, now in its second year, brings to life many aspects of General Marshall's greatness for a much wider audience of interested, concerned students and adults. The Legacy series helps us to meet the challenge of keeping George C. Marshall in the forefront of contemporary discussion. It remains part of our enduring commitment to celebrate and share with future generations his remarkable life of achievement. As we look to the future, we see many opportunities that hold promise, just as the future held similar promise years ago. So let's pause now for a few minutes to acknowledge and recognize an outstanding effort by so many for so long. Great job, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. I'd like to welcome to the podium now Kathleen Williams, the Executive Director of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission that supported this project from the very beginning.
I need to use these. Thank you, President Havers, Chairman Adams, members of the Foundation's Board of Trustees, Dan Holt and Mark Stoller of the Marshall Papers Project, and to my colleague from NEH, Margaret Clinton. I'm honored and delighted to be here to celebrate the completion of the papers of George Catlett Marshall, to honor the editorial team, present and past, including the late Larry Bland and Sharon Stevens, and to participate in this fitting tribute to George C. Marshall. One of my favorite items from our collection of photographs about my own agency, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, was taken at the Library of Congress over 65 years ago, in May 1950 to be exact. It was taken at a ceremony celebrating the publication of the very first volume of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, edited at Princeton University. Pictured in the photograph, we have President Harry Truman, H.W. Dodds, the president of Princeton, the Librarian of Congress, and George C. Marshall, who at the time served as president of the American Red Cross. We can readily surmise why Truman and the others are there, but what was the Marshall connection? In his invitational letter to Marshall, President Dodd wrote of his reasons for wanting him there to receive the second publicly issued copy of those Jefferson papers. And I quote, "One reason is that your life and thoughts have been in the Jeffersonian tradition. However, the chief reason is that in my private book, you are America's #1 citizen, measured by standards of wise and self-denying public service." Close quote. America's #1 citizen. That's quite an honor. Of course, Truman and Marshall were old friends and political allies, although Marshall famously wrote, quote, "As to my political faith, I have never voted. My father was a Democrat, my mother a Republican, and I'm an Episcopalian." Truman was instrumental, of course, as we've heard, in founding the Marshall Foundation and providing a repository for Marshall's papers. In one of his last official acts as president, Truman directed the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and the National Archives, where I work, to cooperate with the Foundation in procuring documentary materials and providing access to the records. In Truman's words, to provide suitable recognition to one of the greatest Americans of our age. In a way, Truman laid the groundwork for the documentary edition we celebrate tonight. He charged the commission, where I work, in the 1950s with writing a report on the need to preserve and publish such collections. And by 1964, Congress appropriated funds for our modest but catalytic grants program. Our support began formally with a single grant to the Foundation in May 1977, and we have continued to support the Marshall Papers for nearly 4 decades. The editors of the Marshall Papers have sought out and painstakingly waded through, as we heard, an enormous quantity of original records to edit and publish more than 3,000 annotated documents, including letters, memoranda, telegrams, and speeches, written, dictated, or substantially edited by Marshall himself. Completion of this edition is a tremendous achievement, with the first published volume appearing in 1981 and the 7th and last volume appearing, well, now. A special note of appreciation seems appropriate to extend to the Johns Hopkins University Press for its stellar work over many, many years. The edition continues to be uniformly praised for its quality and editorial excellence. The Commission is proud to have played a part in this monument to this monumental man. The George C. Marshall Foundation has grown into a dynamic center for scholarship, leadership, and statesmanship, including a marvelous museum and research library, which I've had a chance to tour a little of this afternoon. It has digitized nearly 4,000 documents, and this enables scholars and students the world over to access these collections, not only in print form, but in digitized form as well. Now, everyone here will know the arc of George C. Marshall's career. from his service in World War I and his military commands in the years following. Army Chief of Staff, mediator in China, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, architect of the Marshall Plan, and the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. Everyone here will recognize Marshall's stature as one of the great heroes of the age, and in Dodd's phrase, America's #1 citizen. But I would like to conclude my remarks by sharing a note from perhaps the fulcrum of George Marshall's career. At the age of 58, after long stints working in various commands, he served in the War Plans Division, where he was the only individual to challenge Franklin Roosevelt's plan to provide aircraft to England without logistical support or training. With this challenge to the president, Marshall was convinced he had ended his career. Instead, FDR appointed him to be the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall's wife, Catherine, wrote to the president on May 10, 1939, as follows: "Dear Mr. President, ever since your appointment of my husband as your next Chief of Staff, I've wanted to write to you. It is difficult for me to put into words what I really feel. For years I have feared that this brilliant mind and unusual opinion were hopelessly caught in more or less of a treadmill. That you should recognize his ability and place him in your confidence gives me all that I have dreamed of and hoped for. I realize the great responsibility that is his. I know that his loyalty to you and to this trust will be unfailing. It is with the deepest feeling of gratitude and happiness that I send you this note of thanks." According to the Marshall Papers, Marshall received his orders to report for duty as acting Chief of Staff on June 27th of 39, and he was promoted to general and sworn in on September 1st, 1939, which happens to be the same day the German army invaded Poland. Talk about timing. His life and his country's fortunes would be forever changed. Congratulations once again to the Foundation, to the editors, and to the project staff of the Papers of George Catlett Marshall on preserving for generations to come primary sources that document the place of this remarkable man and his remarkable times. Thank you.
Welcome to the podium, Margaret Clinton from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you. I'm the Deputy Chair at the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm very pleased to be here and speak on behalf of the NEH, representing Chairman William Adams, who is unable to be here tonight. I'm very pleased to be able to be part of this ceremony and to bring greetings to all of you and to my fellow speakers, as well as to honor George Marshall and celebrate this completed edition of his papers. This achievement, 40 years in the making, makes General Marshall's work and words available for scholars, students, and citizens now and for future decades. It is an essential resource for understanding the history of the 20th century and the shape of the world today. This celebration also coincidentally comes as the NEH marks its own landmark. The endowment is an independent federal agency created in 1965. It's one of the largest funders of humanities programs in the United States, now celebrating our 50th anniversary. Consistent with our founding legislation, NEH serves and strengthens our republic by promoting excellence in the humanities and conveying the lessons of history to all Americans. NEH grants typically go to cultural institutions such as museums, libraries, colleges and universities, public television and radio stations, as well as to individual scholars. The grants strengthen teaching and learning in schools and colleges, facilitate research and original scholarship, provide opportunities for lifelong learning, preserve and provide access to cultural and educational resources, and strengthen the institutional base of the humanities. We currently have a grant-making budget of about $115 million annually. With the arrival of Chairman Adams in 2014, NEH launched a set of new initiatives under the rubric, the common good, humanities, and the public resonance with the American people that lend themselves to the methods and concerns of the humanities, as well as to support community dialogues, documentary films, and a series of programs under the Standing Together initiative that speak specifically to the concerns of veterans and our society at large around the impact of war and life after service. These programs, for example, include support for veterans returning to academic study, the creation and preservation of veterans' oral histories, and several important film projects, such as Ken Burns' film War, about World War II, and his forthcoming series on Vietnam. Well before the Standing Together initiative had started, however, the NEH has been supporting scholarship on General Marshall for more than 40 of our 50 years. Forrest Pogue, who's been mentioned before, received grants for over $250,000 between 1972 and 1979 as he worked on his biography of the General. And since 1982, the Marshall Foundation has received NEH grants of over $670,000. The Marshall Edition stands alongside a remarkable group of similar projects supported by the NEH, including the papers of statesmen like George Washington and John Adams, literary lions such as Mark Twain and Willa Cather, and American originals like Thomas Edison and Martin Luther King Jr. Like the Marshall edition, all of these editions also rely on scrupulous transcription and rich annotations to make hard-to-access documents available for a variety of audiences. Scholars use them as they work to make sense of the past. Teachers use them to bring the voices of historic figures to life in their classrooms. And the public uses them to understand how the past shapes the present and our collective future. General Marshall's long career and significant service to America makes this edition a real resource for all these readers. A military leader in war and peace, an advocate for international stability and reconciliation, a Nobel laureate in 1953 for his successful work on the Marshall Plan for the recovery of Europe after World War II, Marshall is a central figure for understanding America and the world in the 20th century. He led the effort to win the war and to win the peace in the 40s and 50s, and the documents in this edition, from secret letters to congressional testimony, reflect his key role in the dynamics of war and peace in the early Cold War period. Like many of these projects, the Marshall edition is the result of a wide and successful collaboration. As you've already heard, editor Mark Stoller and managing editor Dan Holt brought to successful completion the work pursued for 30 years by the late Larry Brand. These editions rely on the dedicated work of staff who put decades of their lives into the volumes, such as the late Sharon Stevens, Mame Warren, Greg Frank, Joanne Hartog, Marilyn Holt, Bob Keefe, Don Van A, and Ann Wells. The project's advisors, a team of distinguished diplomatic and military historians, helped the staff to put the work in the necessary scholarly context. The staff at Johns Hopkins University Press produced handsome volumes. The communities of Virginia Military Institute and Washington and Lee provided valuable resources for the work. A variety of foundations and other funders, including the National Publications and Historic Records Commission, made the work possible. Perhaps most important, the George C. Marshall Foundation provided financial support, institutional context, and space for the edition's work. The Foundation's commitment to providing a free digital version of the edition is a tremendous contribution for scholarly and public understanding of Marshall and a model for other such editions. All of these contributions and collaborations resulted in the successful completion of this important edition. I'm honored to be able to be here tonight and to bring greetings and congratulations from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Congratulations on this wonderful achievement.
Very much indeed. I'd like now to welcome to the podium Mr. Dan Holt, the Managing Editor of the Marshall Papers Project. Dan.
Well, I sat around trying to think what I was going to say on this occasion, and as a lot of you know, I'm at loss for words most of the time. I decided instead of talking about the individuals in this, I would address them importantly as a team for the editorial work. However, first I want to point out there were documentary editors who laughed at us when they learned we were planning on completing the final 2 volumes in maybe 7 years, particularly in light of the fact that not all the team would be full-time on site. Mark Stoller and I joined the team in October of 2008 on Volume 6. We sent the completed manuscript of Volume 7 to the press in August 2015, a little less than 7 years. What made all this possible? So again, what do I say here? The teamwork and those outstanding individuals comprising that team are probably one of the best groups I have worked with. Now, I've worked with outstanding teams in the past, and I have to give you a little background on this so you know where I'm coming from. After retiring as director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, I swore that nobody could outdo the teams I worked with at that institution. And based on over 50 years of my professional career, I was convinced I was right. But to compare that to the Marshall Papers team is really not fair. At the Eisenhower, with 5 buildings on 22 acres, 52 people on the payroll, it had required 4 teams working in coordination, and if one slipped a little, it was not a major calamity. But at the Marshall Papers, with a final team of Mark and I, 2 full-time and 1 part-time full-time in Lexington, and a variety of contractors, was much more difficult because if any one individual faltered, we were in major trouble. So I've changed my mind at this point and pleased to say this team could rise to any occasion and ranks as the best team with which I've ever worked. Now I want to put a final note, a lot of people may not be aware of this. At the conclusion of this team contributed many gratis hours to complete this project. General Eisenhower once told his staff that planning is everything, the plan is nothing. In the planning stage, if you discuss the details, you address what might happen, the possible problems were discussed, and the planning allowed for continual adaptation and improvisation, then the plan itself is subordinate. And we had intense dialogue here, discussions, debates, whatever you want to call them, and we were constantly making adjustments. But much as Eisenhower and Marshall, I have long felt that the Eisenhower-Marshall success secret was they totally understood their mission, their abilities, and each other's personality. They also had intense discussions, professional disagreements, but the two did not require any explanation of their feelings because they understood each other and respected the other's professionalism. That was true here as well. One word on documentary editing. If you have not worked directly on that type of editing and the complicated, intense research and the very careful objective writing involved, it is impossible for you to fully understand the high level of scholarship required. Now I'm not going to mention all the staff again because they've been covered. However, a special toast to Brian Shaw, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, the founder of the feast, so to speak, for having the fortitude to try something innovative and for assuring the Marshall Papers project would continue to its conclusion. Matter of fact, I have been called by 3 documentary projects asking how we managed this. I am not telling them anything. It takes the staff, and they're not all going to have the same staff. A special thanks to our longtime supporters in PRC and NEH for not only their continued financial support, but importantly, for giving professional sanction and status to our project and our efforts. And to Johns Hopkins University Press for its patience, and to Bob Brugger, who I had the fortunate time period to work with him when I edited Eisenhower's pre-war diary. So, Bob, take my thank you back to Johns Hopkins. The team expresses their thanks to all the other staff at the Marshall Library, who assisted in many ways, but I will talk about those who worked most closely with us. Alice Lee, who handled all of our schedules and supplies, and Mark and me, and that's no easy task. Jeffrey Kozak in the library and archives here with assistance for library research. Carol Wheeler on the grants and the budgeting, and Jane Dunlap early on the grants. It's not easy to write these grants. thanks to all your requirements. To the Papers Project team, I will have to mention a few names here. May Morin absolutely had all the computer skills we needed. And you know, 2 screens and all this, moving all this material around and around and around constantly without losing it. She could do that. I would always lose it. Excellent researcher, writer, and it was interesting to watch her grow as a historian. Now, I want to tell you something else about documentary editing. She was handling a lot of the cross-references. Now, every document in most of these volumes is cross-referenced to other documents pertaining to the same content or subject. Every time Mark or I or someone made a change, moved the page, take something out, put something else in, those all changed. Maine handled all that. And Ann Wells, the most minuscule, detailed, intense researcher and copywriter I've ever known and will ever know. Greg Frank, who was mentioned earlier, fresh out of Washington and Lee, was wonderful to watch this young man grow into the position and accept responsibility. And then there's Mark Stoller, who I've known for years, and we're not going to go into all that. Over the years, I've observed genius, I've heard of genius, but now I had the honor to work with genius. To the team as a whole, given the lending to the current Marshall Foundation president, I could use the famous phrase, never have so few, but I won't do that, although it fits. I say no one could have done it better. You're unmatched. And as George Marshall said often, well done, well done.
Thank you, Dan. Very well said. Dr. Mark Stoller.
How do you follow that? All of you. Dan did make comments about me that were totally untrue. I'll deal with him later about that. What I have decided as an historian is to give you a brief history of how this team came together. The answer in a nutshell is Brian Shaw, and I am deeply saddened that Brian could not be here. He was planning to be here, and then someone scheduled a meeting for him in Richmond at 4 p.m. this afternoon. Brian became the foundation president soon after Larry Bland's sudden and tragic death in 2007. Now, after a failed search for Larry's successor, Brian came up with a novel solution whereby Dan Holt, who had recently retired as director of the Eisenhower Library, would serve as the project director and the managing editor, while I, who had recently retired from the history department at the University of Vermont, would serve as the historical editor. Now, neither of us, Brian knew, and he told me that he knew this, would ever agree to leave our hometowns, Abilene, Kansas, and Burlington, Vermont, to move here. But if we took advantage of modern technology, most notably email, to transfer documents as well as to correspond with each other, plus the copier, plus the telephone, plus USPS, plus FedEx, we could work from our homes but be in constant communication with Larry's associate editor, Sharon Stevens, who would continue to work in Lexington, and we would join her in Lexington maybe 3 to 4 times each year to iron out problems that had arisen and figure out the next steps. Now, when I had taken early retirement from the university, I did so with the crack: I am not retiring from the profession, only from the corporation. Little did I expect an offer like this. I was flabbergasted by it. And my immediate reaction when Brian flew up to Burlington and came up with this was that I didn't have enough knowledge to do this. I couldn't possibly do this. Which he said, well, who does, if you claim that you don't? And I said, well, Larry Bland. Can't do that. And then I said, but Forrest Hogue. But we can't do that. And so it hit me. It was my turn. It was my turn. And who could say no to the honor of working on the papers of such a model of selfless service? Dan and I owe Sharon a great deal for teaching us the basics of how this project worked. But when she became ill, she had to leave the project, which she did in 2011, and she died in 2013. But again, Brian to the rescue. Before her death, Brian, seeing what was happening, added additional staff to supplement and then to replace Sharon. Ann Wells, who also works for the Journal of Military History for editor Bruce Van de Voort downstairs, also co-author of numerous works with Douglas MacArthur biographer D. Clayton James. Mame Warren, former director of the Hopkins History Enterprises at Johns Hopkins, and a series of recent Washington and Lee history grads to assist Sharon. The third such person, Greg Franke, stayed on for far more than the 1 year that the others served. Even after he had moved out of the area, out of a sense of duty to the project, and I'm deeply sad that Greg cannot be here today. I think the sense of duty that I mentioned for Greg affected all of us. How could it not do so, given the man whose papers we were editing? Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, I think, said it best in 1951. Most men are slaves to their ambitions. General Marshall is the slave of his duties. This is the team that Dan and others have hailed in their comments. A team that completed volume 6 in 3.5 years and then volume 7 from scratch in another 3.5. Each of us brought our unique skills to the project. Only together could we have completed this work. I cannot praise them and salute them enough. I will, however, give you the compliment that you were all paid by one of my colleagues, who just said, in terms of this project, you are doing the Lord's work. And historians and graduate students will bless you for it. I remember Sharon at one point holding up a volume, waving it, and saying, "This will outlive all of us. This is the official record." There goes my watch, which I better pick up or you will be here a long time. Professors are used to speaking for 50 minutes. I promised, but Dan said he gave me 1 minute, so I have 6 instead of 5. I want to go to the other people already mentioned. Robert Beisner, George Herring of the Advisory Committee, and Alan Millett of Ohio State for the 7th volume. There's another person on the committee, Edward Mack Kaufman of the University of Wisconsin, who served unbelievably, and I checked, he is the only one, on each advisory committee for all 7 volumes over a period of nearly 40 years. Beyond that, Mack served as Forrest Poe's early research assistant, and he then trained both Larry Bland and me in military history when we were graduate students at the University of Wisconsin. I believe he was also instrumental in getting Larry appointed as editor of the papers and me being asked to write a brief bio of Marshall. And I am, of course, terribly saddened that Mack cannot be here, and I salute him. Also, the members of previous advisory committees, and Dawn Van A, who has been mentioned, Joellen Bland, Larry's wife, who worked in different ways on each of the 7 volumes. Former Foundation President Fred Hatzel, who started the project during his tenure and served as the project director for the 1st volume. Also, Professors Ted Delaney and David Peterson, who chaired the Washington and Lee History Department and invited me 4 times to teach the intensive 1-month spring term, thereby enabling me to work with the team for an entire month on top of the 1-week stays at other points during the year. Foundation staff, most notably Carol Wheeler, Jane Dunlap, Alice Lee, who helped us on so many aspects of this project, And I have a whole list of the others, and I'm terrified to read it because I'm afraid of missing somebody's name. But very quickly, Paul and Debbie Barron, Jeffrey Kozak, Lee Marilyn Holt, Danelle Wilt, Evan Haberman, and of course, Brian Shaw, and the advisory committee that Brian had when he put this idea together. Casey Brower, Barry Machado, Rosemary Shelton, and Tom Henriksen, and my apologies to anyone whose name I have missed. Special thanks also go to archivists who cannot all be mentioned. In fact, it takes up almost a full page in the acknowledgement section, but I want to mention one above all others, Timothy Nenninger, the head of the Modern Military Branch at the National Archives, another Matt Kaufman student, who consistently responded to our numerous calls for assistance and whose knowledge of military archives is unmatched. On the day last year that Mame Warren sent Volume 7 to the Johns Hopkins University Press, Dan, in an email, aptly quoted and updated General Eisenhower's famous message after Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Quote, "The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled," he changed the date, time, at 12:30 hours local time on 24 August 2015, signed Holt. Dan aptly continued, "Ours was indeed an allied effort with many different but committed participants. Thank you all."
Mr. Stoller, thank you very much. We spent a lot of time at the Marshall Foundation thinking about history. It is a wonderful thing to be able to say that this team and this foundation has, with the publication of Volume 7, actually made history. So thank you, all of you, and everyone who went before to make this happen. It is a wonderful achievement for all of you and for the foundation itself. And I hope General Marshall and Larry Bland, looking down, would be proud. I'm sure they are. We have 2 copies of the Marshall Papers Volume 7 to award to Margaret and to Kathleen. If you'd like to come up and will be captured on camera, it is quite heavy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very exciting.
It is indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. It's been a great celebration thus far. Please join us at in the lobby for the reception. Thank you very much indeed.